Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of History 130 online at SUNY Delhi. Nice work getting through week 1. And if any of you feel like you didn't do what you needed to do during the first week, just recognize that I am flexible and I want you to be successful in this class. And I get it that it's a weird transition to figuring out how to do a class online. So I want to make sure that you can be successful. So if you didn't get everything done for the first week, reach out to me. I'll work with you. I will still accept late work, and I want you to figure out what you need to be doing. So this week we will incorporate more reading and a longer presentation than the previous. And as we continue going forward, some weeks are going to be heavier than this, some weeks are going to be lighter. But one thing to remember is that if you feel weighed down with work, try to spend the amount of time you would normally be in a classroom working on this course, in addition to whatever time you would normally spend doing homework for a brick and mortar class. So maybe that's more of a pep talk to myself than all of you because online is a lot of work. For instance, was thinking I could just reuse my presentations from last semester, and that's not working. I really need to cater them to a new class, just like I would if I was in an actual physical classroom. So, um, there are some benefits to being online, though. You really can work at your own pace, and if you're still not feeling it and need to do something else at any given time, you can go ahead and do that, and then come back to your coursework when you're ready. So, another real advantage, I think, of being online is that with your discussion board posts, you can weigh your words carefully before typing them. That's a lot harder to do in a physical classroom, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what all of you have posted for the first week's discussion board. I'll start grading those early tomorrow morning. So let's get myself out of the way. This is a picture of Lord Curzon claiming India for the British crown. And so this week I want to talk about, the early modern world on the eve of becoming the modern world. So this course is on modern world history, and that word modern has a very specific meaning. Most historians date the modern era to the era post 1789. That's the French Revolution. So the world became radically different after the French Revolution. So let's jump over here. So for the first two slides, I want to emphasize something that was sort of in the background last week, the idea of the rise of the West. In the early modern period, say the time period between Columbus's voyage and the French Revolution, the West went from being an underdeveloped backwater to a leading center of world power in large part, now this is still somewhat of a contentious claim, because of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. Certainly, there were technological and administrative innovations that made this possible as well, but the disproportionate wealth that came from the New World through the exploitation of the souls of Africans and native peoples was the game changer that allowed the West to rise. And let me be very clear, it was wrong. What you see in the picture for slide 2 is a star representing the center of global trade, which in the years between 1492 and 1750 shifted from the Middle East. This is where global trade was centered before the discovery of America by Europeans, or for Europeans, I should say. It shifted from here to here. The bulk of the wealth of the world was going through the Atlantic by the 18th century, so by the 1700s. And again, that wealth was coming from enslaved people. So that's my slide. But I absolutely love the Gonick illustration on pages 2 and 3 of the reading. And if I was to modify it, and yes, that's one of your focus questions, I would make African dynamics a much bigger deal. I really like the scope of the early modern histories that Gonick covers over the next few pages. It can be a lot to take in, but I think we can do it. So I want to spend the next few minutes really just giving a background to everything that Gonick is talking about. All right, so last week, a huge turning point that we dealt with was the discovery of the Americas. The first resource that the Spanish exploited there was gold and silver. At first, they just stole it from natives, but soon they began to build mines, especially at places like the miserable, murderous, high altitude mines in Potosi, Peru. Potosi would become the primary revenue source for Spain, and Spanish minted silver made it all over the world. This caused a global crisis, as the amount of currency in circulation was far than ever before. Economies from Kanem-Bornu to the Ming Dynasty in China, from Russia to Zanzibar, all experienced what's been called the price revolution, with its accompanying great inflation. Basically, for barter economies to evolve into currency based ones, where an agreed upon form of money could abstractly represent value, you needed something people agreed was precious. Since gold and silver are rare and shiny, and we humans are a lot like raccoons, that worked. But there just wasn't enough of these precious metals to base economies around until the massive pillage of the New World. So, after this influx of gold and silver, economies could specialize better with more access to money. I'm not saying there wasn't money before this, I'm saying that there wasn't as much. So, the disadvantage is that no one really understood how economies worked. So, just adding more money without more labor productivity and product meant you had out of control inflation. This inflation spread around the world. The Great Inflation was a key factor in bringing down the Ming Dynasty in China. As one example that Gonek also covers, the Ming Dynasty had arisen in the 1300s in response to Mongol rule of China. The Mongols were foreigners who arguably caused China and much of Asia to thrive through revitalizing ancient trade routes like the Silk Road. But the Mongols had a hard time keeping control in the aftermath of the Black Plague, which originated in their area. So, after a period of instability, the Ming Dynasty arose. In its early years, the empire sponsored adventurers like the amazing, incredible Zhang He, who was contemporaneous with European explorers like Henry the Navigator. Zhang He's massive treasure fleets to East Africa caused both spectacle and disdain in the imperial capital. He once, for instance, marched an East African giraffe to the emperor as a present, and the Ming, in response, eventually sunk his fleet to the bottom of the sea, deciding that this was a colossal waste of money and opting instead to sever foreign alliances and build a wall. The Great Wall of China, as we know it today, was built under the Ming, though there had been earlier walls under earlier dynasties too. So, despite their initial insularity, with time the Ming grew tied into global trade as well. Silver coming from the New World across Asian and oceanic trade routes eventually devalued their currency to the point that they became too unstable. And after a period of instability in 1644, Manchus, a non Han Chinese group, established the Qing dynasty. Gonek covers this quite well, albeit quickly, in your reading for this week, and I really didn't spend any more time than he did. So, in a couple of weeks, we'll come back to the Qing relationship to global trade, especially their efforts to control things like illicit drugs. They wouldn't do so well in their fight against British drug dealers, leading to the devastating Opium Wars and ultimately the insanely horrifying Taiping Rebellion. But for now, let's leave off with the Ming in China, ultimately imploding due to the effect of a global economy that they thought they could control with things like walls and trade barriers. They couldn't. Another period of the world, or another of the areas of the world that Gonek sets up for this week is Japan. He deals with the period when Tokugawa established a rigid form of feudalism, the Tokugawa shogunate, to replace what had been a long period of instability between rival warlords. This shogunate, established at the tail end of the 16th century, like the Ming dynasty, was insular, though more extremely so. Trade was limited to one Dutch ship per year, and like in China, a feudal system emphasized production at home rather than the vagaries of global trade. Remember that this is the same period that a few small European countries like the Netherlands, France, and England were growing fabulously wealthy from the exploitation of slave labor and global trade. In 1868, this shogunate would be replaced by the reestablishment of an emperor, and Japanese people would embark on a breakneck process of modernization, turning themselves into a first rate world power by the end of the 19th century. They did this largely by mimicking the developmentalist and imperialist policies of European states. It sucked to be on the receiving end of this imperialism too. I don't want to glorify Japan. This is, what led to World War II in the Pacific. So Gonek ever so briefly deals with the decline of another major empire, the Mughals of India. Last week you read about, sometimes pronounced Moguls as well. That's where our word Mogul comes from. So last week, you read about the powerful gunpowder empires. The Mughals certainly were one of them. At their height, they were an empire that celebrated diversity in a way that so many of us could learn from today. India has always been a diverse region of the world, but the degree to which political units on the subcontinent see diversity as either a source of strength or a liability has varied throughout their history. The current Modi government in India has been extremely Islamophobic, for example. But at the height of the Mughal Empire, they were very much the opposite. The Mughals themselves were Muslims, but it was their ruler, Akbar the Great, a redundant name as Akbar is Arabic for great, who realized that to unify his empire, he as a Muslim should marry a Rajput Hindu princess. As Portuguese traders and missionaries were plying the coast in this period, he encouraged one of his children to convert to Christianity. So this is in the late 1500s. He was a scholar who loved to have debates in his court on religion and came up with his own philosophy. Sul el Kul, it's still around today. Peace with all, essentially recognizing that real divine truth transcended human beings' narrow understandings of it. So, in his realm, Hindus and Muslims lived in peace, as did the newly emergent Sikh movement, as well as older groups of Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Jewish people, along with both old pre Portuguese contact and new post Portuguese contact Christians. What is so ironic about his reign is that this was the same period that the French wars of religion and ongoing Protestant Reformation were ravaging Europe, where millions of people were dying in religious conflict. Uh, but I don't want to overpraise the Mughals. They could be very stupid too. It was only decades later that Akbar's great grandson, Aurangzeb, would use Islam as a way to mobilize his forces against Hindu enemies. In the early 1700s, then, the once great Mughal Empire had imploded on itself as people followed an intolerant idiot of a leader. Through this infighting, they left themselves disorganized and easy to be divided and conquered as Portuguese, French, and eventually overwhelmingly British traders began to exploit and carve up the empire. As you read in Gonic, they did this by getting local rulers to turn on each other in return for favors from the European powers. This massive destruction of India at the hands of unscrupulous colonialism, as well as stupid, intolerant local leadership, would would lead to the once prosperous Mughal Empire becoming one of the most impoverished places in the world. As a fun aside, the town your school is in, Delhi, was named after the capital of the Mughal Empire. India was still known for decadence in the late 1700s when our town was named. So one of the founders of Delhi, Ebenezer Foote, decided to name it that's the local pronunciation, Delhi, to make fun of one of the other founders, Erastus Root, who wanted to name it Mapleton. They did this because Root was apparently a pompous rich guy who everybody called the Great Mogul after the Mughals behind his back. So the people in India got destruction and extreme poverty, but a bunch of British dudes got to build fancy houses and have expensive balls, while millions of Indians starved for centuries. That's one of the reasons I can't stand Jane Austen novels or movies. Ugh. To celebrate the navigation of manners and social norms while ignoring the broken backs of millions of slaves and colonized people who afforded these characters their luxurious, indolent lifestyles kind of just drives me crazy. So you're reading then shifts to the Atlantic slave trade. I had a really hard time with pages 15 through 17. I get that it's difficult to capture raw trauma in any form of art, but using slapstick comedy didn't work for me, except as a way to set up the excellent frame in the middle of page 18, which I've got posted on this slide. When we celebrate the ideas and values of Western civilization, we have to remember who allowed for the leisure time necessary to come up with these things. And we have to remember the debt that is owed them. And part of that debt should include problematizing our philosophies by trying to include the voices of those who for centuries were forced into silence. What Gonick does well, though, is to then outline those heroic efforts to outlaw first the slave trade, then slavery in England and English colonies. The ideas and methods of the English would have a tremendous impact on the transnational efforts to eventually abolish slavery as well. And that's an aspect of Western thought that included lots of black voices that we can all be proud of. So I also want to emphasize that there was never a unanimous consensus anywhere in the world that slavery was okay. There were heroes fighting against it anywhere and everywhere it's ever been. That's the reason slavery is not legal anywhere in the world today, even though it's practiced almost as if it's legal in Mauritania, for example. But that's not to say it still doesn't exist, and certainly we can all draw inspiration from the heroes of the past in ongoing struggles for justice in this world. So, in the period we're covering, many Christians refused to blindly follow supposed Christian justifications for slavery. Muslims, too, as I mentioned earlier, also did not follow these justifications. So, the Christianity of these nonconformists was instead going to be about actually following the anti establishment revolutionary ideas of Jesus Christ. Doing so made these people seem kind of crazy. Nonconformists who emerged in England in the 1600s were numerous by the 1700s and included groups like Quakers, Methodists, evangelicals. They opposed the pursuit of profit for profit's sake and worried about things like the oppression of the poor, which they felt to be incompatible with their religious beliefs. One of these people, John Newton, was a former slave ship captain who converted to evangelical Christianity, wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, which is still prominent among English speaking Christians all over the world today. So in 1781, there was a particularly ugly example of the disregard for human life that came when slavery was mixed with modern economics. The Zong was the name of a slave ship that got lost on its way to Jamaica. In order to make sure that they didn't run out of supplies while lost, crew members threw 130 slaves overboard before reaching their destination. The owners of the ship then attempted to collect insurance payments on their lost property, on the people they had murdered. Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp found out about this and pushed for the owners of the ship to be tried for murder. The egregiousness of this example mobilized people against slavery. What the ship crew and company did was perfectly legal, and yet so obviously morally wrong. They were never tried for murder, but also never received insurance payments for the people they murdered. Mobilization against the Zong owners would create the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. One of the founding members of that society, and I've got other members listed here as well, Olaudah Equiano, had previously formed a group known as the Sons of Africa, made up largely of freed African American slaves who had gone to England after the American Revolution. These people were promised and granted their freedom for escaping to British lines during the war. As an eloquent former slave himself, Equiano showed the British public that Africans were people too, and importantly, mobilized the voices and power of former slaves against slavery. Equiano was also a founding member of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which used methods like boycotts of sugar and newspaper editorials to eventually convince Parliament that slavery was both immoral and unprofitable. In 1807, England abolished the slave trade and abolished slavery in all of its colonies by 1822. Others listed here, like Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce, used legal means to oppose slavery, eventually succeeding in banning the slave trade. Thomas Clarkson tried to show that it was more profitable to do business with Africans than it was to destabilize their governments for the sake of obtaining ever more slaves. And again, so what I'm trying to do here is to give you a background to some of the ideas brewing on the eve of this, radical transformation in thought that would represent the beginning of the modern world. And slavery is one of those relics that would eventually have to go. So when you think of the Enlightenment, you probably think of an era devoted to progress, science, rational philosophies, and a belief in the potential of humanity. What's a little ironic is that so many absolutists, or totalitarians, to use a more 20th century term, were also fans of the Enlightenment. In their minds, science and progress were all good provided they made rulers more, not less powerful. But starting in the late 17th century in the British Isles, among other places, you had thinkers who argued that the Enlightenment needed to include rights too, what John Locke would call natural rights. In Locke's writings on the social contract, he argued that humanity had once lived in a state of nature, it's building on Thomas Hobbes' ideas, where they had total freedom, but because they had the freedom to do anything, there really was no freedom at all because everyone was a victim to everyone else's whims. Governments emerged as people gave up only those rights which would increase the liberty of everyone else. This is the social contract. So you might lose your right to rob and murder, for example, but you gain a right to live and have possessions. So when he wrote the English Bill of Rights in 1688, he argued that governments had a duty to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. This idea is the intellectual origin of classical liberalism. Another prominent Scottish thinker was David Hume, who became known for, among other things, a reinvigoration of the old Greek idea of skepticism. The way he reimagined it, one should not take anything for granted, but question everything. This becomes key to political ideas like the divine right of kings, to which Hume would respond, says who? Hume's ideas really invited intellectuals and eventually broader populations to question the world as they saw it. So the 18th century, the 1700s, became in many parts of the world an exciting intellectual atmosphere where people felt free to imagine entirely new social and political orders. Those imaginings would have the most impact in one of the more oppressive places to live in the 1700s, France. Here, people like Rousseau, who I've got on the left, built on Locke's ideas and argued governments had a duty to do the most good for the most people. Rousseau's idea of doing things for the greater good would gain a really nasty connotation as it became a later justification for the terror during the French Revolution. Rousseau didn't live to see that, though, and I think Gonek kind of plays up that guilt a bit too much. Another French philosopher, Montesquieu, argued that different government types have different virtues and are better for different kinds of people. Naturally, absolutist rulers used his ideas to argue that their government type was best for their people. So a dictator is going to say, my people need a dictatorship. Then on the right, you had Voltaire, who was light-hearted yet profound, in the vein of modern day political comics. One of his major contributions was that liberalism could only work with tolerance, that tolerance of, especially religious differences, was crucial to a successful Republican form of government. So, all these liberal ideas in the background. Uh, I mentioned at the beginning that the French Revolution was the beginning of the modern world. Certainly, we're in the United States of America. I wouldn't want to give short shrift to the United States either. So, all these liberal ideas are in the background when American colonists were able to frame their tax dispute, really a minor tax dispute with Great Britain, as something far more grand. No taxation without representation captured the idea from the English Bill of Rights that government couldn't act without the consent of the governed. That idea brought some to the patriot cause, but what brought a lot more people over to the cause of rebellion was the intellectual ferment seen in documents like the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's Common Sense. With eventual French, Spanish, Dutch, and Polish assistance, Americans would win their independence from Britain. The American Revolution would become an experiment in liberalism. It's ongoing. Um, if you voted in November, you were part of that experiment. And one of the deals I like to make is that if you give me evidence that you have registered to vote at any point during the semester, I will give you up to 5 extra credit points. So on your first paper. So register to vote if and I know some of you might not be old enough to register to vote, but register to vote as soon as you turn 18 if you are eligible. And if you are not eligible to vote in the United States, try to register in wherever you can. All right. And if some reason you're not able, but you try, I will still give you the 5 extra credit points. So, some of the thinkers that emerged out of the American Revolution that had profound impacts on other liberal movements in the world are listed here, mainly as ideal types of the kinds of ideas that came out of the American experience. You had Jefferson on the left, whose ideas were worth far more than a nickel. His ideas of infusing a republic with democracy meshed well with the liberal aspirations of so much of the world. He was also a physiocrat. He believed that wealth came from agricultural production, that was the core of the prosperity of any society. His role in drafting the Declaration of Independence and eventual Constitution cemented his memory in the history of classical liberalism. He's also remembered, among other things, for his statements on the freedom of the press. Most of you are probably also aware of his history of slave owning, that complicates so much of his legacy. John Adams has been remembered for his insistence on the rule of law, especially the need for a continuation of English common law. He believed in the need for a strong federal government and was suspicious that democracy taken too far could produce the kind of mob rule he felt to be present in the French Revolution. Then on the right, you've got Alexander Hamilton, who really pioneered the idea of a government that could provide support for a society built on the new ideas of capitalism. Finally, for the revolution to succeed, it seems that you needed, like so many revolutions since then, a person around whom a cult of personality could be built. That farmer and slaveholder of good manners, martial prowess, and a solid Republican sentiments was George Washington, a modern American Cincinnatus. The Roman Cincinnatus was the Roman farmer who became dictator in a time of need, fighting the Etruscans, then returned to his farm when the emergency was over, rather than seizing power for himself, as Julius Caesar would later do. So Washington led the Continental Army and was the first president of the United States, and to many people then and since, an all around Paul Rudd type of nice guy. Um, didn't mean to imply that Paul Rudd is a slaveholder. So this, if you need a break, go take a break right now because we're gonna delve right into the French Revolution now. So this is we're not in an actual classroom. You can pause anytime you need. All right. So shortly after the War for American Independence was over, the French Revolution began, and some of the key causes that feature in most histories of the Revolution are listed on this slide. A big one was France's debt, accumulated over a century of nasty wars, mostly with England, the most recent of which was the American Revolution. In 1788, to be able to better collect taxes, Louis XVI decided to convene an ancient medieval assembly called the Estates General that hadn't convened for over 150 years. The Estates General split the population according to feudal categories: the nobility, clergy, and third estate, the peasants. What the king didn't expect was that the third estate would take this so seriously. The peasants also represented the majority of the population. So, over the months between his announcement and the time when the estates general were to meet, peasants, often aided by clergy, collected complaints and began to view this meeting not as a way to help raise taxes, but as a way to have a say in their government. The king grew alarmed when the peasants tried to meet before the official meeting in June of 1789. He locked them out of the assembly hall, so they instead met at a nearby tennis court. There, under the leadership of Joseph Emmanuel Sieyès, who had previously written a tract arguing that since the peasants made up the majority of the population, they should have the majority of votes. There, under his leadership, they signed the Oath of the Tennis Court, basically vowing to meet together until they were the legitimate governing assembly of France. Peasant uprisings started immediately, mostly attacking landlords' estates and burning any paper that mostly illiterate people thought might be a contract. The storming of the Bastille was a symbolic act of revolution 1 month later, and by August, the assembly was meeting regularly and had published its own revolutionary document that is also a foundation of liberal theory, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They abolished special privileges for the nobility and began to function as a governing assembly in conjunction with a monarchy. The comic on this page, this painting is a funny from the 1700s. It shows how life was before the revolution. So the peasant is carrying the noble person and clergy person. The noble person has all the feathers on his back. And a rabbit that he's not allowed to hunt is eating his crops down here. And then on the very next slide, you see after the revolution, the peasant is now being carried by the noble person and led by the clergy. Well, he gets to eat the rabbit. He's clearly killed the rabbit, and his cabbage down here is doing just fine. So, while the American Revolution was set an important precedent, it was really the ideas of the French Revolution, in part because of Napoleon's later expansionism, that would transform the world. Within a few decades, French inspired revolts were occurring with regularity all over the world, and you could argue that the next more than 100 years would be the long century of revolution. So, one nice way to capture how the revolution transformed society is with the idea of the transformation of subjects into citizens. Basically, a subject is acted upon, but a citizen has a share in what the government does. To accomplish this, French revolutionaries imagined the nation to be an ethnic whole. There was a book that came out almost 40 years ago by Benedict Anderson that argued after the French Revolution, people around the world began to imagine nations and imagine ethnicities as sharing something in common, something timeless and essential. The idea then was that France would be a nation state, a country where everyone was the same and proud to be French. This is the birth of nationalism. And the reality of France was that people had different beliefs, different ideas. They spoke different variants of Romance and even Celtic languages that were German as well, that were often not mutually intelligible. And they required institutions to be able to feel like they had something in common. So one institution that accomplished this better than others was the army, or National Guard as it was called. When the French Revolution got underway, France was still at war with enemies like Prussia and Austria. To be able to continue fighting these wars while carrying out governmental change at home, revolutionaries decided to have a levée en masse, or a conscription, a draft of all unmarried, able bodied men between the ages of 18 and 25. There were no exceptions for the nobility. In the army, people learned to read and write, to speak a standardized version of Parisian French, to appreciate French culture and histories, and to begin to see themselves not as residents of their villages or regions, but as something larger, as French. This idea of nationalism would spread like wildfire across the world over the next 2 centuries, and be both an inspiration and a catalyst to numerous bloody wars. So, while the new government was quite popular, at the end of 1791, 2 years after the revolution, revolutionaries couldn't really leave well enough alone and continued, especially within the assembly, to advocate for more radical change. The political parties that emerged were the People of the Mountain, the Girondins, who advocated for slow change, and the Jacobins, who were more radical, and the sans culottes, meaning no breeches, to show their street cred. If you were a fancy French person in this period, you wore poofy breeches that look like balloonish shorts. But if you're an ordinary person, you just have pants, sans culottes, like this dude in the painting. So, one of the early moves that alienated people from the revolution was an attempt to nationalize the Roman Catholic Church, meaning that the state would appoint clergy rather than Rome. The state feared the power of the church, but in trying to counter it, violated people's right to faith as a private affair. The eventual Vendée uprising against the revolution would be motivated in large part by faith. So in 1792, the king fled and became a prisoner, eventually being executed. In late 1792, in protest of prices, people stormed the assembly, and a coalition of Jacobins and sans-culottes gained power. The next January, the Committee of Public Safety was formed with Robespierre at its head. Over the next year and a half, he executed 40,000 people as enemies of the revolution, often using the infamous guillotine. An additional 40,000 largely civilians were killed in the Vendée uprising. Robespierre went so far as to nationalize Notre Dame and create his own church, what he called the cult of the Supreme Being, to replace Catholicism in France. He was eventually guillotined in the Thermidorian reaction, named for the month Thermidor, or July. Revolutionaries did some radical things like remake the weeks and months and even implemented the metric and Celsius systems of measurement. So things were relatively peaceful for the next 4 years until the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon was a successful general, or at least a general who knew how to play up his successes and misrepresent his defeats as victories, like the failed Egyptian campaign, where he abandoned his army to return to Paris as a hero. Through coups and intrigues, he followed in the footsteps of Julius Caesar, as he got appointed first consul of the Republic, then first consul for life, then eventually Emperor of France. In English speaking countries, he's often remembered as a dictator. England was his biggest foe, and the US, as part of the English speaking world, even though at war with Britain during Napoleon's reign, has largely adopted the negative view of him. In so much of the rest of the world, though, even in Russia, where he found his eventual defeat, he's remembered for spreading the ideas of the revolution. When Napoleon conquered somewhere, he set up local assemblies, gave people the right to vote, encouraged nationalism in their own local languages and traditions, and joined people to the successful French continental system, which was an economic union that was largely a successful counter to British economic prowess. When Napoleon's Grande Armée, his big army, marched against Russia in 1812, it was made up of 500,000 mostly non-French people, especially Poles, German speakers, Italians, Slavs that didn't even have agreed upon names for themselves yet. Slovenes, for example, usually called themselves Illyrians or Carinthians in this period. The name Slovene would come later. When he was finally defeated, rose again, then was defeated for good, he left a memory of hope for many ordinary people across Europe and the Middle East, and a memory of terror for the monarchs of Europe. So, very briefly, when Napoleon was finally defeated, the Congress of Vienna was the treaty among the monarchies of Europe that rearranged the borders of what he had conquered and established a new order based on unified resistance to revolutions, an understanding that states should keep a balance of power with each other, and that states, meaning countries, would have a willingness to intervene in other European states to stop future revolutions. There's a few tidbits like that on this slide. So, my final two slides show the long-term effects of Napoleon. Europe in 1815 was made up of empires and disunited German and Italian states. Due to pressures of nationalism over the next 200 years, Germany and Italy would unify and empires would slowly come apart. Um, Most recently in 2012, when Montenegro officially separated from Serbia. I should probably update this map here, showing farther east that Crimea has now rejoined Russia as well, and the Donbass region of Ukraine has seceded from the rest of the country. But at least a map that everybody agrees upon has existed since 2012. So the first revolution that can be tied to the French is the revolt that occurred in France's colony of Saint-Domingue. When the French Revolution began in 1789, there was already a series of revolts occurring in Saint-Domingue. When the what becomes Haiti. So when the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen was published in August, it reached Haiti within weeks, and despite widespread illiteracy among slaves, its ideas still spread like wildfire. The idea that all men are naturally made slaves um, are the, the idea that all men are free, naturally made slaves say, hey, what about us? Slave owners tried to assure their slaves that the ideas didn't apply to them, but that didn't really quell the infectious fire of these ideas. What made the revolt on what would become Haiti successful was that it had the legitimacy of an idea, a philosophy of liberalism that could not be compatible with slavery, though many countries across the world would try to combine the two. One person who came to lead the rebellion was Toussaint Louverture, pictured here, a literate, free black man with extraordinary charisma and military skills. In Haiti, most of the slaves were recently brought from Africa. One of the sickening facts about the Caribbean is that most slaves were newly captured, as few lived for long in the horrifying plantation conditions. What that meant is that the slaves in Haiti came from destabilized regions of West and Central Africa and had a lot of military experience. They knew how to fight, and with proper organization and inspiration, the French could not deal with them. In 1794, the French recognized Haitian autonomy. When Napoleon tried to rein them in after 1802, the Haitians, ready to defend their independence, fought back, creating clever alliances with the Spanish and English as well. In 1804, their independence was recognized by France, which by then had given up most of its claims to the Americas, including agreeing to the Louisiana Purchase, which would transform the young United States of America. But the idea that slaves could form an independent republic was inspirational across the Americas. It inspired the Spanish speaking colonies, gave hope to slaves everywhere, and scared the living daylights out of the slave owners across the Western Hemisphere who did everything they could to destabilize, delegitimize, and isolate Haiti, giving the country a long, difficult road to travel. But it also inspired slave revolts in the United States, along with a harshening of attitudes towards slaves in the United States. All right, that was a lot. That was 6,000 words. Um, so feel free to take a stab at some bonus questions for, again, a maximum of up to 10% of the final course grade. So 5 bonus points here. So these are short, sweet, and nice. All right, and again, you have access to all of this on your PowerPoint that I've pasted to Vanco Hall. So again, if you have any questions about anything or want to talk about anything at all, remember that I have office hours Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 a.m. at the Vanco Hall link that is, or at the Zoom link that's posted on the top of the Vanco Hall page for this class. All right, thank you everyone, and enjoy week 2.